Clare died in 2021, 4 years ago. She'd been diagnosed with motor neurone disease 2 years before that. And from that moment, she knew she had an appointment with death, but she just didn't know when the meeting was scheduled to take place. So every month, the pair of us would attend the clinic in Beaumont. This is Professor Hardiman's clinic. And we would arrive along with the other MND sufferers. Now, in this clinic, you have a large waiting room and 6 rooms off the waiting room, each one almost cubicle-sized, had a therapist within, and each of the therapists delivered a report on a monthly basis, updating us on how the disease was progressing and how to handle the next stage of the illness. And so it went on for 2 years. Progression began with breathing and sleeping at night. Then there was the slurring of the voice and ultimately the loss of speech. There was the inability to swallow and the introduction of the PEG feeding. PEG stands for percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy. So I would feed her liquid nutrition through a tube in her stomach. And this went on for months until eventually the choking episodes took place. These were caused by the pooling of saliva and mucus that would drain from the head and would pool somewhere around the throat. But when it pooled, it brought about sort of these choking, these spasms. So I operated a glass tube which Clare would direct through her mouth into her throat, and I would switch on an electric pump that would then extract the juice from the pooling area. And it was during one of these drowning episodes, about 3 months before she died, when she wrote on her electronic pad, "Enough is enough." Well, I couldn't answer that. I had no way of dealing with that particular question. There was nothing I could do about it. We just had to get on with life. She met her death at 1 o'clock in the morning. It was a Monday. Our younger son, Killian, was sleeping in a camp bed on one side. And a nurse shook his shoulder and told him he could go home now because she was gone. She had no choice. She couldn't keep that appointment with death on her terms. The right to die was denied her by a law that was passed in 1993, describing assisted death as murder, and that carried a penalty of 14 years in prison. She had been induced into a coma through palliative sedation. So in the hospice, you have palliative care. And palliative care, in its own way, is a form of assisted dying, because when Clare went in on the previous Tuesday, there were no goodbyes. She sat up, tapping onto her phone, text messages to her tennis friends. But when the coma was induced, when the palliative sedation began, 3 pumps were brought into her system, allowing her to just fade away in a bed. But because of COVID, she died pretty well on her own. So modern science has enabled the caring profession with remarkable powers to maintain life. So I work as a solicitor, and I'm engaged pretty well exclusively in the area of end of life. Killian now runs the business that I helped to found in 1992, and over the years, the practice has accumulated over 10,000 wills, and these belong to people who live mostly in South County Dublin. So Wednesdays are wills days. That's the day I go in on a Wednesday and I talk about wills, and I talk about everything else that matters when it comes to preparing your affairs at the end of life. But there's more to it than just wills. The conversation moves towards managing end-of-life issues. So at this point, I encourage the families to talk to each other and have a conversation about what happens at the end. And we address subjects such as dementia and mental capacity generally, so that what is critically important is that the conversation concludes with an enduring power of attorney. And the idea then that you can avoid having your loved ones face and choose end-of-life options that perhaps you should, while you still can, control and manage by putting them in charge. The Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act of 2015 didn't commence until just 2 years ago. It provides for 5 levels of decision support. And apart from the powers of the Circuit Court in implementing appointments and engagements, the High Court also has inherent powers to intervene when certain life-threatening issues come about. So, from a practical point of view, the solicitor may advise on advance healthcare directives and the appointment of designated healthcare representatives. So what I like to do is to describe these to my clients by painting a bit of a picture. So imagine this. Your loved one is lying on the kitchen floor and you're holding a mobile phone and you just dialed emergency services. They're going to send an ambulance around. As the paramedics then are taking the patient to the ambulance, you go to the hall and in the hall stand there's a drawer, you take out of it a copy of an advance healthcare directive. One that was prepared before, it was witnessed, it was signed, it was dated, and it is legal under this act. It's enforceable. Now that's a new thing. Before, it was always, you assume that the next of kin would step in and make decisions when the patient was unable to do so, but that theory is now gone. The idea of the next of kin is past tense. You've got to have something to put somebody in charge. Now, if you don't, well, either the HSE or professionals will make that decision for you, or an application will be made to the Circuit Court. And that involves a court case. And again, we're back into the Act to see how these orders are made and so on. So you're saving a lot of trouble by having this little piece of paper in that hall stand, so that the doctors know what to do. The point about this is that the directive states how you do not wish to die. It will say something like no resuscitation, no peg feeding. It'll say things like that. But what it won't say is how you wish to die. Because in every sense, an assisted death is murder. And this brings me back to Clare and my failure as her husband of 40 years to offer her a choice at a point in her terminal decline when she was suffering agonizingly. There are others like her who are faced with a terminal situation. Tom's already mentioned the options. Janie has two about possibly going to Switzerland and joining that procession. So to the loved ones at home, this extreme action seems cold and callous. To me, it seemed just as cold and callous to have denied Clare a peaceful end at home in an armchair, surrounded by her family, her grandchildren, where we would all have a chance to say goodbye. You've also heard Tom mention, and Jamie, the debate that took place in Dáil Éireann. In fact, it was in the Oireachtas, because it was the joint houses of the Oireachtas, the Seanad and the Dáil, over 9 months when they discussed this before a joint committee on assisted dying. Both Janie and I testified to that committee. Not sure, Tom, you were there as well. So the three of us all testified before this committee. And eventually, 38 recommendations were handed down, and in which the committee recommended that it was time to introduce legislation. Of course, the chairman insisted on issuing a minority report, and of course, because he was the chairman, he was able to do that. It didn't really matter, because when the Dáil went to vote on it, they agreed it's time to bring the law around. But then, of course, we had to change government, and the current one has no appetite for it at all. So let's just think about opponents and what they say. They say that the repeal of Section 2 of the Suicide Act augurs the decline of moral standards and the introduction of a culture that feeds societal approval for the concept of suicide. That's not true. Opponents say that the elderly will be forced to opt out of life in order to accommodate the comfort and pocket of the following generation. That is also not true. They say that in other countries such as Canada and the Netherlands, where the terminally ill are allowed to choose, that vulnerable people are being killed. That's just not true. If it is possible to alleviate the suffering of one dying patient, then our legislators are duty bound to pass a law governed by the balance of that possibility, rather than act on the assumption of a preconceived probability. And on that point, I'll just leave it there and let you